Hi guys, it is Tamara. Thank you so much for coming back to my channel. Welcome back. I'm glad to be back on my channel, guys. I, found myself really trying to process how I would be able to get back on my YouTube channel after the loss of my grandmother. And I did try to stay in touch with you guys using community posts and, posting pictures and reflections and things like that. But I am glad to be back. I feel like I need a little bit more time to recuperate. But I figured, during this time of recuperation, it can be somewhat healing if I jump into the area where I feel most useful, and that's my career, my position. I also think that it would be helpful for me to go over the various stages of grief and loss and talk about the traumatic components of that. So in today's video, I'm going to be talking about the different types of grief and traumatic loss that there is. I have done multiple videos on grief and loss and trauma. But I think that it's proper and in place for me right now to just talk about the different types of grief that you're likely to experience. So I'm going to try to post some of those videos around me, like at the top here in the cards, and then I'm going to post them in the description box for you as well. So let's just go ahead and jump into this video. Thank you so much for coming back to my channel. For those who are subscribed and have been participating and being a part of my grieving process, thank you so much for all your support and your kindness and for your questions and your posts. I really appreciate that. And for those who are new to the channel, I encourage you to hit the subscribe button right over here so that you can stick around with us and be a part of our growing and validating community. The benefits for you in today's video is that I'm going to be talking about the various types of grief and loss, and I want to highlight what each stage is and what you're likely to experience. So I lost my grandmother about 2 weeks ago, and we had the funeral last week. And, I took off that whole week, and I did some clients for Monday and some for Friday, but I took off Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. And I thought that would be a little bit of time for me to kind of, decompress and de-stress and really focus on me. And I realized that, by the time I had gone through Tuesday, the day before the funeral, and then Wednesday, the day of the funeral, and then Thursday, the day after, I really wasn't ready to go back on Friday like I had thought. I thought that I would be able to just jump back into my work and be energized and motivated. And I realized that, okay, that's not quite what's going on here. I'm not quite ready yet. So, I thought, well, you know what? I'm a psychotherapist, so I should be able to kind of help myself through this process. And I realized that, I can help others, but to apply that information to myself, it's going to take a little bit of rationalizing. It's going to take a little bit of just turning things into less emotion and more logistics. So I kind of stepped away from the emotions a little bit, and I began to look up the various types of grief. And I recognized that, we can experience various types of grief within a short period of time, within days, hours of a death or a loss. So it's important to identify, where am I, what stage am I in? So I'm going to highlight these stages for you because I'm sure you have dealt with these stages as well. And I think one way to feel healed and renewed is to clearly develop an understanding of where you're at and what stage you're in. So I'm going to point those out right now. Okay, so the first stage that a lot of people fail to realize that they're in, and it starts at the time of the loss, and then sometimes it carries on for the rest of that person's life, sometimes for years, months. The stage is known as prolonged grief. Prolonged grief is the stage where, the grief starts and you begin to feel like this hole in the inside. It's this cavity of loss. And you feel very all alone and just kind of confused, and you don't feel like yourself. You're going through a rough patch. That prolonged grief is titled or defined as prolonged because it lasts for a long period of time. It doesn't just end when you bury the loved one. It doesn't just end when you say goodbye. It doesn't just end when you tell yourself it's over. It lasts for a long period of time. Prolonged grief tends to happen with death. It seems to happen in divorce situations and in situations where a child is adopted or fostered, right? That grief is just prolonged. It stays that way for long periods of time. Now, the next stage, if you're not in the prolonged stage, then you can certainly be in the delayed grief stage. And the idea behind delayed grief is that you don't show grief symptoms immediately, right? That person may have walked out of your life, or they may have died, and you don't show that stage of grief and those emotions just yet, right? It may take years, it may take months, it may take hours before you begin to show those symptoms of grief and loss, right? So the delayed grief process means that you're actually internalizing your emotions until you're able to process them. And then later, boom, it hits you. And then you're like, oh my God, I miss that person. Or, I don't feel like myself, or I haven't been thinking like myself, right? I'm drained, I'm tired, right? So the prolonged grief stage can happen, and so can the delayed stage. Okay, you don't show it right away. It shows up a little bit later. Okay, the next stage is something known as anticipatory grief. Anticipatory grief. And I have on my notes right here that anticipatory grief is the idea that you know that something is coming, right? It tends to happen with individuals who are diagnosed with cancer. It tends to happen with individuals who are diagnosed with terminal illnesses. You know that a death is likely. So you're kind of anticipating it. It still doesn't take the sting out of death. It still doesn't take the pain out of that loss, because you anticipate that it's coming, but at least you anticipate it, right? So you're grieving before the loss and after the loss. And that can feel like a huge punch to the gut, because that grief is so overwhelming before the loss and after the loss. You anticipated it for so long, and boom, here it is. And it can really knock you out from under your feet. Again, this tends to happen mainly with terminal illnesses, infections, diseases, age, things like that. All right, anticipatory grief. The next one that I have here is inhibited grief. And inhibited grief is the idea that you don't outwardly express your grief symptoms, right? You don't outwardly cry. You don't outwardly look depressed. You look fine. You seem okay. But on the inside, you're hurting. Something is gone. Something is empty. And that inhibited stage of grief has a way of just really weakening your defenses, right? Because externally you appear okay, but internally you're crumbling. You're falling apart. Usually when you're experiencing inhibited grief, you begin to experience what's called somatic complaints. And what that means is you begin to have headaches, you begin to have maybe tension in your face, you begin to have muscle tension, you begin to have muscle spasms, right? So that internalized grief or inhibited grief becomes physiological. It is not emotional. So we're not going to see you cry. We're not going to see you go away and hide and withdraw and isolate. You're going to smile, you're going to laugh, you're going to look okay, but internally you're crumbling. All right, so that's inhibited grief. The next grief or stage of grief is known as complicated grief. Okay, and complicated grief is the idea that the grief is complicated by other factors, right? So you may be going through grief and loss because you lost somebody that you love, but then you're also going through depression and anxiety because now you've developed a mental illness because of the loss, right? So that can complicate the picture and complicate the situation. Another way to kind of look at this is, you're an individual that has always had depression symptoms, and now you have a loss, and that is complicating the grief, right? The fact that you're experiencing the stages of grief, the denial, the anger, the depression, the bargaining, right? You're experiencing all of those things. And there may be times when you feel like you're experiencing the acceptance stage. I don't know. Go ahead and look in the description box below. I'm going to post an article on those stages so you can learn a little bit more about them. But what complicates grief, again, is you may be going through those 5 stages of grief. You may be rotating, right? One day you accept, the next day you're in denial again, the next day you're angry, and then the next day you're depressed, right? So you can go through those stages in multiple ways, right? It's not a linear process. So let's say you're going through the 5 stages of grief. They're tending to rotate. What complicates the situation is that you've already had depression for years, or you've already had anxiety for years, or you've had suicidal thoughts in the past, and that's complicating the picture of grief, right? So we don't know if this is a mental illness or grief. It's complicated, okay? So that's complicated grief, all right? The next kind of grief is known as traumatic grief, and that's when the loss or the grief is traumatic to you, right? Trauma is an emotional, psychological, and physiological response to an event that you're not prepared for. Okay, it's an emotional, physiological, and psychological response to something that you're not prepared for. That's trauma. You don't have the tools to manage the situation that you are now being forced to deal with. Okay, that is trauma. If you don't have the tools to manage the situation and this grief is overpowering to you, you can experience traumatic grief. Okay, and that's the kind of grief that's not easily minimized. That's the kind of grief that's not easily rectified by counseling. It's going to take a variety of approaches, and it's going to take a combination of approaches. Okay, that is traumatic grief. Now, the next is what's known as exaggerated grief, and basically, exaggerated grief is the idea that you've experienced that grief and loss, and now there's an additional component that's exaggerating the entire situation. Okay, an example of this would be, you lost your mother or your grandmother or your father, and what makes this whole thing exaggerated is that on top of losing them, you lose their entire estate, right? Or on top of losing them, you now have lost your home to burglary or a fire, right? So it's something that exaggerates the reaction to that primary loss. Okay. Also too, with exaggerated grief, multiple areas of your life is impacted by that one grief, okay, that one loss. So let's say, for example, you lost your mom. Well, now you're getting ready to lose your job because you can't function because of the grief that you're experiencing. So, it becomes an exaggerated kind of a situation, okay? The next is collective grief, and that's a grief and loss that you experience collectively. So as a nation or as a group of people or as a family or as a community, okay? It's something that happens within society and it collectively impacts you. It's not just you as an individual, it's everybody as a whole. Okay. The next is ambiguous. An ambiguous grief stage is basically the idea that there's no clarity in the situation. Okay. If you think about past traumatic news where airplanes have gone down and alligators have devoured the passengers on the flight, that's ambiguous grief. Because what happens is there's no body, there's no remains, there's no ceremony, there's no funeral that can be held. So there's no clarity in this situation. You may also experience ambiguous grief if there is an unrecognizable body that you are now having to bury, right? It doesn't look like the person that lived. The person looks completely different. There's no closure because of the way that the individual died. Okay. So ambiguous grief can be really, really, really heartbreaking. That's the word I'm looking for, because again, you're not looking at a person that you knew that has died. You may not have a body at all. You may only have a photo of that person, or you may not have all the remains of the person if something terribly traumatic happened to them. So that's ambiguous grief. There's no clarity. So you're experiencing grief because you have no closure, basically. All right. The next stage of grief is normal. And normal grief is just the idea that you're going through the normal physiological, emotional, and psychological process of that loss. You're experiencing this whole. You break down and cry sometimes, or you feel lonely and upset, but then you get right back up and you do okay, right? Your baseline is stability, although there are times when you need that extra support. That is normal grief, okay? Normal grief. You're experiencing the proper grief and loss stages, but your baseline is stability. You're able to return back to a place of normalcy despite what you're feeling. When you're not able to do that, then that's when we need to be looking at other stages. Are you in the ambiguous stage? Are you in the collective stage? Are you in the prolonged stage? Are you in the delayed stage? Where are you here in terms of your grief? But if you're in normal stage of grief, you're good, because you're going to experience that pain. You're going to feel lost. You're going to feel grief. You're going to feel empty, but then you're going to go right back to your baseline of functionality in a healthy way. And that's what you want. All right. Now, the last kind of grief that I have on here is what's known as disenfranchised grief. And And that is the grief where, you know, you begin to feel this loss because people minimize and undermine your suffering. They feel like, well, she was 82, you know, or she was 93. Why are you so hurt, right? She was bound to go. Or a suicide, right? Well, they're the ones who committed suicide, so why are you grieving over them? That is disenfranchised grief. When people from the outside make assumptions and they say things like, why are you worried about it? They were bound to die anyway. They kind of minimize your grief because they feel that you really shouldn't be grieving in the first place. Okay, that's disenfranchised grief. I think it's important to know where you are in terms of the grieving process, because if you're feeling all these emotions and you don't know how to label it, you're going to feel even more confused. But having a label, having clarity about what you're going through, and being able to go to a therapist or your primary care physician and say, hey, look, I think I'm in this stage of grief, is going to be very, very helpful to you. I think you can help to push yourself forward if you know exactly what you're experiencing. Until you recognize what you're experiencing, you're going to remain confused and hurt. I think healing starts when you educate yourself to where you're at. Healing also starts when you begin to recognize which stage you are in so that you can get to the next stage, which is healthy and normal grieving. Thank you so much for being with me today, guys, in this video. I encourage you to give it a thumbs up if it was helpful, and go ahead and hit that subscribe button so you can stick around with us. If you have been in a situation where you've dealt with any of these forms of grief that I talked about today, let me know in the comment section below. Are you still in those stages, or are you feeling a little bit better? Let me know. I'm interested to know. Thank you so much once again, guys, and I'll see you soon. Bye.